Part 1. Commissioner moved through the halls of the Universal Nightmare Commission with growing frustration. Her body was made of a thick, clear gel that shifted and flowed as she traveled. The halls around her were built from crystal that sang soft notes when touched by light. They were beautiful, as all things in the galactic core were beautiful. But beauty could not solve the problem that had kept her awake for 300 cycles. Species were dying, not from war, not from disease, not from the great cosmic disasters that sometimes swept through star systems. They were dying because they had forgotten how to be afraid. Entered her office and activated the holographic display that floated in the center of the room. The numbers appeared before her, cold and terrible in their simplicity. 47 species had gone extinct in the last 1,000 cycles, not endangered, extinct, gone forever from the universe. The Harmony Collective had been the most recent. 40 billion souls, all connected through a perfect mental network that allowed them to share thoughts and feelings across vast distances. They had achieved what most species dreamed of. No conflict, no misunderstanding, no loneliness. They moved as one, thought as one, and died as one when they walked directly into the hunting grounds of the beasts. They were not clever. They were not fast. They were simply large and hungry, and they had consumed the entire Harmony Collective over the span of 12 cycles, because not a single member of that great civilization had felt the urge to run away. Had read the final transmissions. The Harmony Collective had observed the approaching. They had noted the creature's size, their teeth, their obvious hunger. They had calmly discussed the situation through their mental network, sharing observations and theories about what they might want. They had still been discussing it when the first of them was eaten. Not one of them had screamed. Not one of them had fled. The concept simply did not exist in their minds anymore. This was the great paradox that her commission had been studying for 3,000 cycles. Fear was primitive. Fear was irrational. Fear was the mark of lesser beings who had not yet evolved past their animal origins. Every advanced civilization in the galaxy had worked hard to eliminate it. They had developed meditation techniques and genetic modifications and neural implants, all designed to free their citizens from the burden of terror. And now those citizens were dying in enormous numbers because they could not recognize danger when it stood right in front of them. The Serenity monks of Outer Reach had been another example. They lived on a small moon that orbited a gas giant, spending their days in perfect contemplation of the universe. When their astronomers detected an asteroid heading directly toward their home, they had done nothing. Panic would have disrupted their meditation cycles. Fear would have clouded their perfect minds. They had watched the asteroid grow larger in their sky with the same calm acceptance they brought to everything else. 3 million monks had died in the impact. The few who survived, rescued by passing traders, had expressed no regret. They had achieved peace in their final moments. Was that not what they had always sought? Found this attitude maddening. She was one of the few beings in the galaxy who still understood what fear had once meant. Her species, the Eth, had been among the first to suppress it, but they had kept detailed records of what it had felt like. She had studied those records until she could almost imagine the sensation herself. The racing heart, the quickened breath, the desperate urge to flee or fight. It had been uncomfortable, certainly, but it had also been useful. Fear had kept her ancestors alive through countless dangers. It had taught them to avoid predators and poison and the dark places where death waited. It had been the voice in their minds that said, simply and clearly, "This is dangerous. Move away." Now that voice was silent across the galaxy, and species were paying the price. The commission had been created to find a solution. Their official mandate was to study fear across all sentient species, to understand how it worked and why it had developed. The hope was that this understanding would allow them to create an artificial substitute, something that could trigger appropriate survival responses without the unpleasant emotional experience. But after 3,000 cycles of research, they had found nothing useful. Every species they studied had already suppressed their fear responses. The few that hadn't were too primitive to communicate with. The commission had become a place for academics to write papers that no one read, studying a phenomenon that no longer existed. Until today. Turned as her assistant, a young crystalline being named entered the office. His body was made of living mineral, and he glowed with inner light when he was excited. Right now, he was glowing very brightly indeed. Commissioner said, "The deep space probe has returned, the one we sent to the outer spiral arm." Had almost forgotten about that probe. It had been launched hundreds of cycles ago, sent to survey the less developed regions of the galaxy. No one had expected it to find anything significant. The outer arms were considered backwaters, home to young species who had not yet achieved interstellar travel. "What did it find?" she asked. Projected the probe's data into the holographic display. Images appeared showing a small blue and green world orbiting a yellow star. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, a species known as humans. "At first we thought the data was corrupted," said. "The readings seemed impossible, but we've checked them repeatedly. They're accurate." Studied the information scrolling past her. She saw biological data, psychological profiles, cultural analyses. And everywhere she looked, she saw something that had been absent from galactic records for. Fear. "They fear everything," said, his crystalline body pulsing with barely contained excitement. "Death, darkness, heights, deep water, small spaces, large spaces, being alone, being in crowds. They have hundreds of specific fears, each with its own name. They fear things that have happened, things that might happen, and things that they know will never happen." Absorbed this information slowly. It seemed impossible. Every other species she had studied had worked to eliminate fear as soon as they became advanced enough to do so. The Harmony Collective had removed it through genetic modification. The Serenity monks had meditated it away. The crystalline hegemony's own people had simply evolved past it through pure logic. But humans had kept their fear. They had carried it with them as they developed technology and built civilizations. They had not seen it as a flaw to be corrected. "There's more," said. "They actively cultivate fear. They create stories designed to frighten each other. They build structures specifically for the purpose of triggering fear responses. They tell their children tales of monsters and dangers." "Why would they do such a thing?" asked. "We don't know, but the results are remarkable. Their species has survived countless disasters that would have destroyed any of the civilizations in the galactic core. They detect dangers that others would ignore. They react to threats with speed and intensity that our models cannot explain." Looked at the images of Earth, this strange little world where fear still lived. She thought of the Harmony Collective, walking calmly to their deaths. She thought of the Serenity monks, watching their destruction approach with peaceful smiles. "Contact the Galactic Council," she said. "Tell them the Commission has found something, something that might save us all." Glowed even brighter. "What shall I say we found?" Turned back to the holographic display, watching footage of humans running, hiding, fighting, screaming. They looked primitive. They looked irrational. They looked terrified. They looked alive. "Tell them," she said, "that we found a species that remembers what it means to be afraid." Part 2. Dr. Aura had spent 40 cycles doing nothing but studying the data from Earth, and he still could not fully comprehend what he was seeing. His photoreceptors, the organs that allowed his species to perceive light and information, had dimmed from exhaustion. But he could not stop. The humans were too fascinating. He sat in his research chamber, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every aspect of human civilization. Medical data, psychological profiles, historical records, entertainment, art. All of it pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Humans were afraid of everything, and they had turned that fear into strength. Commissioner entered the chamber, her gelatinous form flowing smoothly across the floor. She had been receiving his reports for days, but this was her first time visiting in person. "Tell me," she said simply. Aura activated a new display. It showed a human brain with certain regions highlighted in bright colors. "This is the amygdala," he said. "It's a small structure deep within the human brain. In most species that once had fear responses, this region has shrunk over time, becoming smaller with each generation until it served no purpose at all. In humans, it remains fully active. They never suppressed it," observed. "No, and what's more, they developed extensive neural connections between the amygdala and their higher reasoning centers. They didn't just keep their fear. They learned to think about it, to analyze it, to make decisions based on it." Aura pulled up another display, this one showing a list of human terms. "They have created an entire vocabulary for different types of fear: terror, horror, dread, anxiety, panic, phobia. Each word describes a slightly different experience, a different flavor of the same basic emotion. Why would they need so many words for the same thing? Because to them, it's not the same thing. A human who fears heights experiences something different from a human who fears small spaces. They've learned to distinguish between these fears and respond to each appropriately." Studied the list with growing wonder. She had spent 3,000 cycles searching for species that still possessed fear, and now she had found one that had developed it into an art form. "Show me examples," she said. Aura was happy to comply. He had collected thousands of examples over the past 40 cycles, each one more remarkable than the last. "This is a structure called a haunted house," he said, displaying an image of a dark building filled with artificial monsters and frightening decorations. "Humans pay currency to enter these buildings and experience simulated terror. They walk through dark corridors while other humans dressed as monsters jump out at them. They scream. They run. They laugh. They laugh. Yes, when the experience is over and they know they're safe, they often report feeling happy. They describe the fear as enjoyable." This was difficult for her to understand. Her ancestors had feared, but they had never enjoyed it. Fear had been a burden to them, something to be endured rather than sought out. Aura showed her more examples. Horror movies that humans watched by the millions, stories designed specifically to frighten them. Books about monsters and killers and supernatural threats. Games where the purpose was to survive dangerous situations and defeat terrible enemies. "They tell these stories to their children," Aura said. "Tales of wolves that eat little girls, witches that cook children in ovens, ghosts that haunt the living. At first, we assumed these were warnings meant to teach children about real dangers, but most of the threats in these stories don't exist. Humans invented them specifically to frighten their young." "That seems cruel," said. "We thought so too, but the research suggests otherwise. Human children who hear these frightening stories actually develop better survival skills than those who don't. The stories teach them to think about danger, to plan for threats, to imagine what could go wrong and prepare for it." Aura pulled up a new display, this one showing human history. Perhaps most remarkable is what they've accomplished while carrying this burden of constant fear. They feared the ocean, but they built ships and sailed across it. They feared the sky, but they invented machines to fly through it. They feared the void of space, but they constructed vessels to travel between worlds. He showed images of humans climbing mountains that made them dizzy with terror, diving into oceans that filled them with dread, exploring caves that triggered deep panic in their minds. They did these things not because they weren't afraid, but specifically because they were. "They call it courage," Aura said. "They define it not as the absence of fear, but as the choice to act despite fear. They consider it one of their highest virtues." Absorbed this information in silence. She thought of the crystalline hegemony, people who made decisions based purely on logic and probability. They never acted unless the data supported action. They never moved unless the outcome was reasonably certain. They had died by the thousands to the void worms, creatures that presented no immediate logical threat until they were close enough to feed. Humans would have run from the void worms. They would have felt the ancient warning in their blood, the primal scream of their ancestors saying, "Something is wrong here. Something wants to eat us. Leave now." "What do you recommend?" asked. Aura had been thinking about this question for 40 cycles. He had run simulations and consulted with colleagues and reviewed every piece of data the probe had collected, and he kept coming back to the same conclusion. "We need to talk to them," he said. "Directly. We need to understand not just what they fear, but how they live with it, how they make it work for them instead of against them. You want to make contact with a primitive species that hasn't even developed faster than light travel." "Yes, because that primitive species has something we lost thousands of cycles ago, something that might save every civilization in this galaxy." Considered this for a long moment. Making contact with undeveloped species was not forbidden, but it was unusual. The standard practice was to wait until a civilization reached a certain level of technological advancement before welcoming them into the galactic community. Humans were nowhere near that level. But humans had something that no advanced civilization possessed anymore. They remembered what it meant to be afraid. "Prepare a contact team," said finally. "I want to meet these humans myself." Aura's photoreceptors brightened with excitement. "What will we tell them?" Turned to look at the holographic displays still showing images of humans running from dangers both real and imagined. She saw them screaming in their haunted houses, jumping at shadows in their horror movies, telling their children tales of monsters that lurked in the dark. "We'll tell them the truth," she said, "that the galaxy is dying because we forgot to be afraid, and we need them to teach us how to remember." Part 3. Ambassador Sarah stood in the main hall of the Universal Nightmare Commission and tried very hard not to panic. She had been afraid of public speaking her entire life. Even as a child, she had trembled at the thought of standing before a crowd. Her heart would race, her palms would sweat, her voice would shake and crack. 20 years ago, she had forced herself to overcome that fear. Not eliminate it, but manage it. She had practiced until she could speak clearly even when her heart was pounding. She had learned to use her nervous energy instead of fighting it. She had become one of humanity's most respected diplomats precisely because she understood what it meant to be afraid and to act anyway. Now she stood before an audience of beings from across the galaxy, creatures of crystal and light and living gas, all of them watching her with organs she couldn't even identify. None of them had ever felt what she was feeling right now. That familiar flutter in her chest, that tightness in her throat. They wanted her to teach them. "Let me make sure I understand," she said, keeping her voice steady through long practice. "You want humanity to teach the galaxy how to be afraid." Commissioner flowed forward, her gelatinous form catching the light. "We have studied your species extensively. You possess something we lost long ago. We believe it is the key to survival." Sarah thought about how strange this was. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 2 decades ago, when a ship from the crystalline hegemony had appeared in Earth's orbit and offered to share their technology. They had been welcomed into the galactic community as a young species, primitive but promising. No one had paid much attention to them. Until now. "We've reviewed your extinction reports," Sarah said. "The Harmony Collective, the Serenity Monks, the others, they died because they couldn't recognize danger." "They died because they felt no urgency to avoid it," replied. "They saw the threats approaching. They understood intellectually that these threats could harm them, but they felt nothing. No racing heart, no urge to flee, no voice in their minds screaming at them to move." Sarah nodded slowly. She tried to imagine what that would be like. To see a monster charging toward you and feel only calm curiosity. To watch an asteroid falling from the sky and think, "How interesting," instead of run. "Fear isn't just an emotion to us," she said carefully. "It's a survival system. It's been keeping our species alive for millions of years. When we see something dangerous, our bodies react before our minds can even process what we're looking at. Our hearts beat faster to pump more blood to our muscles. Our breathing speeds up to bring more oxygen to our brains. Our attention narrows to focus on the threat and nothing else. The assembled delegates listened with intense focus. Many of them had never experienced what she was describing. Others had only read about it in ancient texts. "We can't just give you this," Sarah continued. "Fear isn't technology. It's not something we can install in your neural networks or splice into your genes. It's the result of millions of years of evolution, of ancestors who survived because they felt the right thing at the right time." "Then what do you suggest?" asked a crystalline being near the front. Sarah recognized him as the assistant who had helped arrange this meeting. Sarah had been thinking about this question since the moment she received the mission briefing. How do you teach fear to beings who have never felt it? How do you explain the monster under the bed to creatures who have never had beds, never had monsters, never had that primal understanding that something in the dark wants to hurt you? "We start with stories," she said. Over the following cycles, humanity launched the most unusual diplomatic mission in galactic history. Psychologists and therapists traveled to distant worlds to work with species who had never needed their services. Writers and filmmakers shared their horror stories with beings who had no framework for understanding them. Survival instructors taught creatures of pure logic to trust their instincts, even when those instincts contradicted the data. Sarah oversaw it all, watching with wonder as the galaxy slowly began to change. The crystalline hegemony was among the first to show results. They were beings of pure logic, making all decisions through careful analysis of available data. They had lost millions to the void worms because their analysis had never identified the creatures as an immediate threat. The void worms moved slowly. They gave plenty of warning. By the time they were close enough to feed, it was too late to escape, but the hegemony's analysis always said there was still time. Human instructors taught them to recognize the feeling that something was wrong even when the data said otherwise. They called it intuition, though it was really just pattern recognition operating below conscious thought. The hegemony learned to pay attention to those small warnings, the subtle signs that danger was approaching even when they couldn't logically explain why. The first test came 12 cycles after the training began. A star in the outer regions of hegemony space began showing unusual readings. The data suggested a possible collapse, but the probability was low. Standard procedure would have been to wait for more information. Instead, the hegemony evacuated 3 billion citizens. The star collapsed 2 cycles later, destroying the region where those citizens had lived. For the first time in their recorded history, the crystalline hegemony had acted on something other than certain data. They had felt something like fear. Other success stories followed. The gas giant dwellers of Nexus Prime developed warning systems based on human anxiety patterns. The ancient libraries of the Knowledge Keepers began including horror stories alongside their scientific texts. A new generation of beings across the galaxy grew up hearing tales of monsters and learning to respect the darkness. Sarah watched all of this with pride and something that felt surprisingly like hope. She thought of her daughter back on Earth, the little girl who still checked under her bed for monsters every night. That simple act, that ancient ritual of childhood fear, was now spreading across 1,000 worlds. One cycle summoned Sarah to her office. The commissioner's gelatinous form rippled with something that might have been emotion. "We have finished our official assessment," said. "Humanity's contribution to galactic civilization has been formally recognized." She activated a holographic display. Sarah saw her species listed in the official galactic records with a designation she had never seen before. "Teachers of productive terror," she read aloud. "Preservers of the survival instinct." "Your species arrived in our community thinking you were primitive," said. "Thinking you were less advanced because you still carried the burden of fear. But that burden was never a weakness. It was wisdom that we had forgotten. Sarah felt her heart beat a little faster. Her palms grew slightly damp. Even now, even after everything she had accomplished, she felt the familiar flutter of anxiety, wondering if she had done enough, if humanity had truly helped, if there was more she should be doing. And for the first time, she fully understood why that feeling was precious. "We were afraid," she said softly. "We've always been afraid. Of the dark, of the unknown, of dying alone in the void between stars. But we went anyway. We built ships and launched them into that terrifying darkness because the fear of not knowing was greater than the fear of what we might find." Moved closer, her form shifting with what Sarah had learned to recognize as respect. "That is what you have taught us," the commissioner said. "Not to fear less, but to fear wisely. Not to silence the voice that warns of danger, but to listen to it. You have reminded us that the species who survives is not the one without fear. It is the one who feels the fear and acts anyway." Sarah thought of her grandfather, the firefighter who had spent 30 years running into burning buildings while every instinct screamed at him to run the other way. He had described fear as his oldest friend, the voice that kept him alive when others grew careless. She thought of her own daily fears, the speech she had to give tomorrow, the report that was due next week, the endless worry about whether she was doing her job well enough. Small fears compared to the terror of a burning building, but the same basic process, the same ancient system doing what it had always done. "My grandfather used to say something," Sarah told. "He said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. He said that the bravest people he knew were always the ones who admitted they were scared." The holographic display still showed humanity's new designation, Teachers of Productive Terror. It sounded almost like a joke, but Sarah knew it wasn't. They had come to the galactic community as the youngest and least advanced species. They were leaving their mark as the ones who remembered what everyone else had forgotten. Fear was not a flaw, fear was a gift. And humanity, for all its flaws and failures and endless anxieties, had never stopped listening to that quiet voice in the back of their minds that said, simply and clearly, "Be careful. This matters. Pay attention." The galaxy was learning to listen again, and somewhere in the distance, Sarah thought she could almost hear her ancestors nodding in approval. They had been afraid too. They had faced monsters in the dark and terrors in the night, and every kind of danger the universe could throw at them. And they had survived. They had endured. They had passed their fear down through countless generations until it reached a little blue planet orbiting a yellow star, where their descendants still checked under their beds for monsters and told stories about things that went bump in the night. That fear had kept them alive, and now it would keep the galaxy alive too. Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety about everything that still needed to be done. There was so much more to teach, so many species still to reach, so many fears to explore and understand and share. The work of the Teachers of Productive Terror was only beginning.